Okay, I just want to double check something.
And I never even caught your name. Like I haven't been referring to you by name.
I go by CoHost.
CoHost. Okay.
There's a recurring gag with every episode where, and with me as always is my co-host, and then he gives some usually pun joke related name that is somehow somewhat relevant to the episode, that sort of thing.
We're going to take you along on an expedition to a strange world, in many ways more mysterious than the upper reaches of the Amazon.
I mean, I think that this is the secret that wants to be told.
Look at this amazing fact. There are these various ways of understanding what it is to be a human being.
The knowledge that reality of consensus is only a very small segment of the total range of what we could feel as real.
I'm doing this with a motivation to clarify, if I can.
Well, yes, I'll put that in very simple terms, which will sound very complex.
This is CNN.
Howdy, listeners. This is Chaos Magic News. We're asking, is this your card? But sort of in an existentialist way. I am your humble co-host with a new edition for our interview series where we find exciting and unique voices in the occult world, and we ask them to let us in on their projects, their path, and possibly other P-related alliteration. I'm pumped to have this person with us, but I want to do it properly. I'm already doing it. But first, from the high desert of Boulder, Colorado, beneath the Flatiron Mountains, about a mile above the sea level portion of the Babylon Matrix, we have Jonathan Zap, zaporacle.com. How is that?
Great.
Jonathan Zap is an author of multiple books, countless articles, a creator of one of the largest, densest, most expansive online oracle systems, sharing his namesake, the Zap Oracle I mentioned. It's for free even, so that's kind of outstanding. You got anything else you want to add, Zap?
We are working on Zap Chat, a large language model version of the Oracle is being built right now by a mathematician, AI engineer friend of mine named Lily Fiorino, who's already created an AI large language model Tarot cross-linked with my Oracle already, called Oracle's Dream. So we're excited about that. It's going to be trained on all my content.
Ooh, so it's the idea would be that you would have an AI that would talk to you through sort of working through these Oracle systems, or
right. I mean, it would just be I think it's called natural English and AI jargon or natural language. You would just give it a prompt, an inquiry, and it would respond in a conversational way. And it's going to be trained on my rhetorical style even. So I've got to record some Oracle readings to provide the training data. So if you know anybody who needs a free Oracle reading, Zap Oracle reading that is willing to have it recorded, that could help me get some of the training data over to Lily.
I think I could imagine a couple people. I'll get with you about that. But
and imaginary people are ideal. So
imaginary. Great. Okay. To kick this off, it is customary in all of our interviews to begin with one simple question. Why should anyone care about chaos magic? Or maybe to a greater extent, why should anyone care about magic?
Because everybody is doing it anyway, to paraphrase Crowley, and therefore it's a matter of doing it well or poorly. Anybody that is having certain types of thoughts, like a negative self-definition, I never get what I deserve, or that's a black magic spell. That's chaos magic that somebody is spontaneously doing, and it's having a very negative effect on their life. So it's about simply taking control, putting your hands on the wheel of the chaos magic car you're already driving, usually in a very poor way, and learning how to do it effectively so that it serves you rather than hindering you.
I just need the chaos magic bumper sticker of how's my driving. That's a pretty solid answer. Now, when I think it's kind of interesting because when we talk about things like this, particularly magic in general, but chaos magic is because it's so sans any kind of structure. It really does turn into a discussion of what you classify as magic, and I think there's definitely room to have that discussion of like everything you do is in some shape or form an inherently magical act because it has an impact on your interactions with reality. But I think sometimes we can also get caught because there's the idea of like, well, the negative narrative that I repeat to myself over and over, that is in some shape or form a magical act that is done unconsciously. But then there's a whole host of more conscious, intentional, and generally ritualistic practices that get put into the idea of magic.
Right. I think there's a hierarchy of magical acts, and maybe Crowley would say that only a really intentional act is a magical act, since
change,
all
conformity
sorts of
with
not particularly sentient organisms are taking actions that change their environment and put things in motion, but don't necessarily meet that intentional definition of magic, where if you are consciously exerting free will, which I think exists but is much rarer than most people would like to think, that now you've entered a different level of magic. I don't try and define it too precisely, but I don't think you can beat Crowley's definition of the science and art of creating change and conformity to will.
It's a solid one. It's hard to beat that one although I think between me and my podcast cohort, we're attempting to find better definitions. We just haven't struck gold yet. But for the uninitiated here, Zap Oracle, a massive, and now you're adding on to it with large language models, but this is a massive Oracle system, something like just under or just over 800 cards, something like that?
I think it's about 720 right now. But the process of adding more cards was interrupted by a need to, a sudden opening to continue the fantasy series I started with the novel Parallel Journeys. But that book has just been completed, but now I'm being called to publish a new edition of my book on the Singularity Archetype. So it's just about dealing with these competing obsessive projects. But I will definitely be returning to the Oracle, and I'm sure Zap Chat is going to compel me to return to the work.
So just over 700, which is still absurd when a standard tarot deck is 72 cards, and then and for the uninitiated, for the people who don't know, these cards, some of them are maybe as small as a paragraph, where it'll have the title or the theme of this particular card, and then you have compiled like writings that go along with explaining what this card really means. So it's almost a dual. It is offering a certain level of interpretation or insight into what this card means right there. And you can pull up the website and start clicking away. And the cards are everything from things like Toxic Meltdown, the Path of the Sacred Highlighter. I got one earlier that was Triangulation. And I had to go in through so these are not only is this a very dense system, but this is, let's see, it oddly specific while still having a general able to be applied across the board to a lot of various situations. But at the same time, you might pull out something that will be oddly specific to your query. Do you want to talk about where that? Mm-hmm. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish that question. Oddly specific. I think there's a variance there with all oracles. This is something that tarot readers and other oracleists don't acknowledge enough. I believe, like Jung, that oracles are basically an attempt to create a synchronicity on demand. That the idea is that you have this diverse set of archetypal signifiers, cards, hexagrams, or whatever, and that then through a seemingly random mechanical process of shuffling cards, or in the case of the Zap Oracle, it's a 64-dimensional algorithm called the Mersenne Twister. But whatever the means is, the idea is that there's a synchronicity, hopefully, where what's happening in the outer physical world of the shuffle, so to speak, is going to sync up with what's going on inside of you, so that the oracle will be a kind of microcosmic mirror of what's happening, the process of energy and change going on inside of you. But what I notice with the Zap Oracle and with all oracles is there are certain zones of time where it seems like the synchronicity is very apparent or in ascendant or something. And when I hit such a zone, I may do multiple readings on different subjects, but there are other zones of time, and I acknowledge this in the documentation of the Oracle, where it seems like it could all be random, and it seems like synchronicity is just not available at that zone of time. And I think that but even though I have some ideas about synchronicity, that maybe everything is a synchronicity, but our ability to recognize that is episodic, or maybe the synchronicity is that you're intentionally getting an oblique and irrelevant response. But this is what I notice with oracles. And I think there's a tendency, like Jung talked about, like, don't overread dreams. It's not necessarily the voice of God. And there's a trickster aspect of the unconscious, and that can play out with oracles as well. And so I think that one should see that not relate to it as like a completely divine, 100% reliable source. Now, once we have Zap Chat, we have a huge difference in the oracle relationship, in that all oracles up until large language model ones have been worked on this acausal principle, as Jung defined it, of synchronicity. But when we have a large language model oracle, now we may combine it with causal aspects, in that the large language model is going to intelligently comprehend your inquiry and pull out relevant content. And however, there may still be another part that's running on synchronicity. So, for example, in Lily's oracle's dream, the cards, the 3-card draw, is still picked by a randomizing algorithm, and then the AI, after the fact, comprehends questions and so forth. So it has causal and acausal means. And so it's possible that we may have both causal and acausal mechanisms at work with the large language model. That's something I have yet to firmly decide. I'm leaning toward the causal, and to have it even pick the oracle cards that it deems most relevant, because we already have the acausal one running with the, computational, but not, LLM oracle version that's existed since 2003.
There's something very interesting in the idea of allowing a large language model, which has now I have a lot of issues with the notions of AI as consciousness, and I won't get into the weeds on that, but even something that you could consider as a pseudo consciousness or a pseudo personality, because it is fed on the collective works of people. In this case, it'll be, this will kind of be your digital reapproximation through your works. And the idea of having that being able to make the decision of like, no, this is the card you need to see right now, or this is the card. I find that a fascinating take on an oracle, like, because I think in the same way that you can never truly have an objective insight into something, you can only have sort of levels. We're all going to have biases and certain issues and certain things that we're not noticing. The act of interpreting cards, whether it's for yourself or for anyone else, and this is for everything, hexagrams, tea leaves, the art of interpretation is going to require a certain level of input from the interpreter. And this is taking and saying, well, how can you do this without a person?
Right. Yeah, because when I do readings in public, and I do them in a lot of festivals, I do free dream interpretation and oracle readings at music festivals and National Rainbow Gathering and stuff like that. And what I found more recently is I used to kind of like slavishly stick to like reading aloud every single card, and like, don't want my ego to like contaminate it or whatever. But more often I find that the first card that's drawn, I may only do a 1-card reading for somebody, may just be a pretext for getting into a conversation with them, where I'm just drawing on everything I know, because I am the creator of the oracle. So, I know what's in the cards plus more besides. And so therefore, why not give the person the chance to interact more with me and with my intuition, because they can do the oracle on their own online for free anytime they want.
You can read what this card means. It's fine. You don't, but I can, but you being in that position, you can offer something more. And just a thought here: if we do look into things in sort of transpersonal concepts, right? If we look at synchronicity as there's this interconnected net of occurrences that are going on, you have to accept that your actions, even if if you're fully cognizant of what you're doing, might be part of a synchronicity for somebody else, and almost has to be.
Right. I mean, I find that oracle readings tend to be magnets for environmental synchronicities, where this two different people, get the same card out of 720 in two successive readings, or that things happen in the environment of the reading that are synchronistically related. And in fact, there was even an advanced school of using the I Ching where practitioners would, instead of drawing a hexagram, would observe things happening in the environment. Oh, here's a woman coming downstairs holding a bowl of water. That suggests, such and such hexagram and so forth. Because since the principle of synchronicity is operant in our lives in general, you can view the whole phenomenal world as an oracle. And that's the idea of omens and portents and so forth. So that's another way of doing it. The idea of a specifically made oracle is that it's a microcosm of the phenomenal world that has interpretations in it. So it's sort of a way of mediating the oracular function of the phenomenal world in general in a more focused way.
Right. Okay. Sort of a side question here. I know in my personal experience, and this is something that gets corroborated by other woo-woos, do you find that oracles, different types of oracles, or even something as simple as like, this is one tarot deck from this particular artist and versus this one, do you find that there might be instances of almost seemingly different personalities that arise? Like you might ask the same question from each of them, and they might suggest the same thing, but the way that it's presented might indicate something akin to an intelligence behind it?
Yeah, I mean, other people have observed that. I mean, certainly it would be impossible to create a tarot with unique artwork peculiar to one specific artist and it not have a personality.
Mm-hmm.
And people have also observed the differences in the personality between the two great oracles, the tarot and the I Ching, that the tarot, and in fact, another Jungian colleague said that, the tarot relates to you from the perspective of the unconscious. Like it presents these somewhat irrational, highly charged images and so forth. And you can project a lot into those images. Whereas so it's more feminine, archetypally feminine in character, whereas the I Ching is more masculine in a solar masculine way, in that can be more reasoned in order and sometimes very strict and exacting and sometimes come at you like an Asian sword master and this kind of thing. So they each have, and sometimes even with a little bit of an oblique sense of humor too. So I think they definitely have personalities, and I decided to just unleash that completely with my oracle, which not only do some of the cards have pages of text with autobiographical reflections, and I say very candidly throughout the oracle that every oracle card was written as a lesson by me to me from my own problems and experiences. But I assume that if I dive into those, that there'll be universal themes that will relate to others as well.
Yeah, I was gonna mention that. It's that because there is a lot of autobiographical, and even the nature of a lot of the photos and stuff are mostly either things that you have taken or there's photos of you. So this, in a way, is really an extension of like you said, of personal experiences that are being extrapolated out into a more universal experience for everyone, which is
right. And I just feel it's more honest to do it that way, because I am the personality creating the oracle. Why should I, like the Wizard of Oz, hide behind a curtain of being a, cosmically detached cosmic intelligence, when that's really maybe sometimes the cosmic intelligence works through me or through synchronicity, but why shouldn't I be honest and transparent about that there's a personality who created this oracle? And in fact, in the recent revision of the oracle, I've created YouTubes, some of them an hour long, for particular cards in extreme examples. So that makes it even more personal.
That almost goes back to what you were talking about of sometimes just, it's like, I know what the card says. So then you proceed to give more of your insight at that moment. The videos almost become another technological extension of this. Same way with the large language model. It's almost as if you're trying to get as much of you into this as possible, so that it's like, well, if I have anything worth saying, let me give you all of it, and you can find what resonates. And if it works, it works.
Right. And that's what I tell everybody before any oracle reading is take what resonates with your inner truth sense, leave the rest. Do not take me or the oracle or my dream interpretations as like the voice of God. If I see scarecrows around everything I say, if it wouldn't be so redundant, I would begin every sentence I ever spoke with, "It seems as if." So the user, I want to empower the user's own discernment. And that's why like revealing the person behind it, I think is a more authentic way to do that, because that's what our brains are adapted to. We're social mammals. There's another person talking to me. Let me pick up from even their body language of how reliable and authentic they actually seem. So it's only fair that I present myself as the specimen that is producing these words for people to evaluate that for better or worse.
There's something interesting about that on an episode we just recorded. I talked about certain magical concepts, like when somebody goes through and saying they got some sort of initiation, or it's like I crossed the abyss, or I became a master of the temple. It's like all you really ever have to go on when someone says something like that is looking at them as a person and deciding, because you can't. It's very rare you're gonna grab yourself by the ankles, pull yourself into the astral realm, and ask one of the secret chiefs, like, "Hey, did so and so actually get this, or is he full of it?"
Right. And I think even if it was an astral entity, you should be just as wary,
That's
or even
true,
more wary of what they say as well. And by the way, this oracle was not completely created by me. It began, the origin story of it, which is in there's a history of it in one of the oracle choices in the drop-down menu.
It started with postcards, right?
Exactly. I grew up in the Bronx, but my dad was an artist. We were always going to the Museum of Modern Art and the Metropolitan Museum of Art on like a every other week basis. And I would buy these little cards that were maybe only a dime or something at the time, given how old I am. And I just eventually in 1978, I had a camera bag full of these cards, and I decided I had my first place of my own that had a refrigerator where I could put up cards with refrigerator magnets. And I decided, well, every Friday I'm just going to put up 4, but I don't want the bother of like figuring out which ones I want to pick out. I'll just choose them randomly, or so I thought, from the bag. But what I discovered was that the 4 cards I pulled out turned out to be an oracle reading, that they had a lot of prescient things to say about the upcoming week. And so so originally it was called the Image Oracle, and it was just these postcards. Then I started adding my own photos, and then somebody said, why don't you write captions on the back so it's not just all your own spontaneous interpretation. And then when it was possible to build it on a website in 2003, it came online on Halloween Eve. And that was not my choice, but happened to be when like 2 computer geniuses and I were available for a 3-way call. But, if you think about it astrologically, the date of conception is very interesting. It also happened to be a very charged evening because my mom was going in for open heart surgery the following morning. But that was when the oracle was, as an online entity, was born, was on Halloween Eve in 2003.
So, and that's another thing I wanted to point out, that this oracle is almost tantamount to a sort of a life's work. And now I know you mentioned you've spent, what'd you say, the conception of parallel journeys started something like 40 something years ago or something like that, to completion.
Right. Actually, they were both my 2 magnum opuses, if you can make a plural out of it, were and a lot of my nonfiction work too, all derived from the spring of 1978, the month of May that we're in right now. So now it's 47 years. That's when I discovered what I called the Singularity Archetype, which relates to the parallel event horizons of death and species metamorphosis. And once I finished the writing a philosophy honors paper called Archetypes of a New Evolution, I got a command basically from the muse that set me on a life mission. I was told that the real way to understand this and communicate it to others would be to write a sci-fi fantasy epic based on it. And that took me 45 years to do, even though I had a master's, an MFA in creative writing from NYU from the 80s, which gave me enough knowledge of what good writing is to realize that the 10 preceding versions weren't good enough until I finally published it in May of 2023. And but after, I wasn't sure if there'd be more, because right now I'm 67. Like, how many 45-year books do I have left? 2, maybe 3 if I really take care of myself. But actually, suddenly the after the election, I got the command. I decided I wouldn't do it unless I was really commanded, but I got the command right after the unfortunate election we've just been through, and that sequel called Parallel Portal came together in just months. I'm just doing the final line editing right now.
It's fascinating. Can I ask a question? Because I've encountered this a lot with fiction, and I think the 2 big examples that I think of are the Illuminatus trilogies by Robert Anton Wilson and Robert Shea, and then The Invisibles by Grant Morrison, which I'm sure you're more than familiar with both. But
it was an invisible synchronicity just before this call, but I'll tell you about that in a minute.
All right. Well, I do notice that there seems to be, and both of those deal with, in a certain sense, the same sort of archetypal, almost apocalyptic experience of the idea of everything going to hell, everything falling apart, and there's this grand potential of like either extinction or evolution. And I just noticed that is a recurring theme in a lot of what I use the term spooky woo-woo to try to humble myself and remember that it's like, sometimes you're just a little bit of a crazy. But I do notice a parallel, and I'll full disclosure, it's been a very long time. And I remember seeing snippets of Parallel Journeys while it was in the process, because I found your website years and years and years ago. But it's been a long time since I've familiarized myself with a lot of it. But I did notice that those sort of recurring patterns in fiction. Do you think that this might be an example, archetype by its nature, I guess, but do you think that this might sort of be a continuation of something that's been getting pointed at for quite a long time in a sort of hyperstition kind of way almost?
Well, what you just described is part of the essence of the Singularity Archetype, and it's easily explainable in formal terms, in that in order to have a massive evolutionary change, because all organisms, including the human psyche, as both Jung and Freud observed, are conservative. They seek to, the homeostasis, a kind of dialed in equilibrium. And then in order to get a massive adaptation or change, you need to punctuate the equilibrium. So this is another way of saying that, apocalypse precedes metamorphosis. And again, relates to those 2 parallel event horizons, because the life cycle of the individual, like a fractal or a hologram where the small part recapitulates the whole, will parallel the life cycle of the species. And so just as the ego will view death as either as emergency, but when Jung called the self, the totality of all the psychic components, including the soul and the ego and everything, will view it as an emergence. When the ego looks at the intensification of novelty happening right now, we are now in the singularity zone objectively because of what's happening with the exponential evolution of AI. I never said that until 2023, but the ego will see it as apocalypse, and the self, in a more transtemporal, pulling back the frame from outer space or something, will see it as an evolutionary metamorphosis. But the ego is not wrong in either case, because death often presents as emergency. If I'm having a massive heart attack, I'm not going to see that transcendently. It's going to feel like an emergency until I'm out of my body. Similarly, what's going on Earth may well present as an apocalypse, but that may be the cataclysm necessary, like the giant asteroid that hit the Earth 66 million years ago, that, as Terence McKenna put it, flattened anything larger than a chicken. But that was the opportunity after 100,000 years before we even had forests again for mammals to come in and fill the breach left by the dinosaurs, and for a much more novel evolution to take place. So what you're describing, and that plays out in all these dystopian science fiction stories and so forth, so that it almost seems like a worn out trope at this point, is actually the essence of the singularity archetype, that there's this dual presentation of disaster transformation.
I think at its core, I don't think it's so much that it is I guess maybe you could always argue that if I've seen it too many times, it's a trope, it's cliche, it's whatever. But I think maybe it has something more to do with we focus a lot on sort of a capital A apocalyptic event and don't acknowledge that there are grand shifts that happen sometimes every decade, or sometime, every couple, the world that we live in. The world that we lived in just after World War II is radically different from where we're at now. And then you could even, divide those up into the 60s and 70s when Illuminatus came out, or the 90s into the year 2000 when the Invisibles came out. It's like, I think that they're trying to wrangle this archetype in terms that make sense for a certain time period.
Right. I mean, so you find it in the book of Revelations. You find it in apocalypticism, goes back to the late Paleolithic. I mean, it precedes not only Judaism and Christianity, but Zoroastrianism. And so it's always been around. It takes on variations. And in the life cycle of the individual, it's always happening. Somebody has a psychedelic experience, a near-death experience, an out-of-body experience, and they encounter the singularity archetype. So there are micro and macro time cycles. We're going through the micro time cycles of individual lives that are being punctuated by shocks like a car accident or whatever. And then we have the macro cycle, which would be the lifespan of the species, which is an expected limited linear time interval. The average lifespan of a species, I understand, is 100,000 years. For a million species, it's 1 million years. We're lowering the average right now with the man-made extinctions we're causing. But this is an expected macro time cycle.
Oh, and so I guess what you're suggesting is that with the rise of, in quotes, AI, large language model, these sort of technologies, you think that this is the real one. It's like there is a hard line of where we are going to cross a threshold.
Right. I think we've already stepped through the looking glass. See, I always resisted. I mean, the oldest game in the world, and that I confronted in my 1978 paper, is end time prophecies, and a lot of this is from my theories of apocalypticism, the projection of the individual event horizon of death onto a collective eschaton. And because people can't deal with the anxiety about the imminence of their own personal death, they project it onto the environment. I even give cases of Elizabeth Steen in the 1960s, who predicted this massive earthquake, and was picked up by copycat psychics all over the country. There were several New York Times articles about it. And on that day, there was no earthquake, but Elizabeth Steen died like a few days earlier of a rare, usually not fatal disease. So I always resisted people putting in a time frame. I gave Terence McKenna a lot of shit to his face about his silly Time Wave 2000 thing and some of the sloppy thinking behind it, though I revere Terence in many other ways.
Would the 2012 stuff in general would fall into that, I imagine?
Exactly. Exactly. And, I had close friends with John Major Jenkins, who was the most reliable person talking about the archaeo-astronomical aspects of it and so forth. But I also wrote something called Carnival 2012, a psychological study of the 22 pitfalls and blind spots of esoteric research, and and why 2012 was kind of a nonsensical projection onto, the ancient artifacts of a Mesoamerican culture and so on. So I always was the critic of any kind of like end date setting. But then in 2023, and it was an amazing and ominous synchronicity with the publication of Parallel Journeys, which I can explain, that's when I realized, okay, now it objectively is the case. Unless there is like a Harrington event or something like that stops technological civilization or something, that there's no one can make a rational case on the exponential evolution of AI not putting us in a zone of exponential unthinkable novelty, to where Sam Altman of OpenAI, just said that the world of, 10 years from now, even may be more different than the world of 2025 than the world of 1500 is from 2025. I mean, so it's, I think it's pretty hard to make a case against we are not having entered a zone of exponential novelty. And another idea I have related to the light and dark theme you mentioned is that my idea about a zone of intensified novelty is that the outer edge of dark and the outer edge of light are both potentiated and intensified. And therefore the novelty is like the amplitude between those two intensified and expanded poles. And therefore we're going to get more diabolical things that we never conceived of, novel forms of darkness and novel forms of consciousness raising, and a lot of it through the same vector of AI.
I suppose the one thing about AI that has gotten me is that there is the genuine concern that this is a bubble, that this is a lot of tech giants pumping a lot of money into something, hoping for these revolutionary technologies that just might not really come to fruition. But the beauty of this is that it's going to be very quick. And I think that might be the funny thing about whether it's the election that just passed, whether it's the emerging of these new technologies, is that maybe, I guess, in a way, McKenna might have been right in that we are, as we're going forward, more novelty is being generated at a faster and faster rate. And it will be very quickly apparent if these sort of radical changes are going to start. And it's one of those that we are always going to live in a post-AI world. And like you said, maybe a solar flare is going to come, or maybe maybe God is going to show up with a really big magnet. And it's like, oh man, the fundamentalists were right. But I doubt it. So the world is already irrevocably changed by this technology. So it'll be interesting to see what does 10 years look like from here. And it's hard. I feel like I feel like I'm stuck between the two poles of this archetype of like, man, the bunch of really exciting utopian things might come out of here. And it's like, it might also all end up in the hands of people who don't mind treating the average Joe like cattle,
Right. I think it's going to be both. I mean, it's kind of like the beginning of Charles Dickens' Tale of Two Cities. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. And that's what it will continue to be, just as like, the internet, good or bad, yes. It's created novel forms of evil and novel forms of amazement and wonder, like our ability to do this podcast right now. So it's going to continue that way. We really need a 2-hour show because of so many things I want to follow up on, but just mentioning that the synchronicity that relates to your question about like, is AI being oversold right now, and will there be a bubble? Because of some of the dangers, apocalyptic dangers of AI don't even require it to evolve at all. So in 2013, when another opening into this book, Parallel Journeys, that I've been getting openings and closings for 45 years, I walked from the parking lot to the front entrance of a real facility in Oracle, Arizona called Biosphere 2, where they had, experiments, and especially in 1991, with enclosing people in a sealed ecology. And the whole scenario that becomes the opening premise of Parallel Journeys unfolded in my mind out of nowhere. And the key part of it was an evil human actor, a single person, using AI to create a self-mutating virus that would cause an extinction level event. And that's the opening, classically dystopian sci-fi premise as it starts, but where it veers off of the tropes of conventional sci-fi is that that's also seen as an evolutionary metamorphosis as well. But anyway, so when the book is being published in May of 2023, that's when ChatGPT-4 more or less was exploding on the scene. And I'm like, oh my God, AI was always part of the Singularity Archetype from 1978. My first study of it, with especially the novel and movie 2001, played a key part in it. So I better start researching AI. This looks like it could be the singularity zone right now. And then I read books like The Coming Wave by Mustafa Suleyman and Crazy Smart by Mogad Watt. And both of these leading AI figures are talking about a possibility that's already existed for 3 or 4 or 5 years now, that somebody with the psychology of a school shooter, access to open source AI like Llama, and a $20,000 desktop gene editor could create novel pathogens that could kill 1 billion or more people, like the opening premise of Parallel Journeys. And that doesn't even require any advance in AI. So their fear is we may not even get to the novelty of AGI and get to see whether the bubble is exaggerated or not, because just the existing technology is already capable of creating an extinction level event. Fortunately, the demographic of people with the school shooter psychology who can gain access to an assault rifle and learn how to use it is much larger than those who would know how to use open source AI and a desktop gene editor, but it would only take one. So this is kind of an ominous synchronization with the sci-fi epic I was instructed to write in 1978.
You ever get that feeling where you're like, man, I hate it when I'm right?
Well, if I'm right about all the things, there will still be a great metamorphosis behind even the dark events. So this is the thing, is that when we pull back the frame enough, the dark events, including even Donald Trump, we could still get to the election if you want. But I would also really like to get into the chaos magic event that happened to me just in the last couple of weeks, and how it's changed my perspective on chaos magic.
Very, very briskly, I wanted to talk about it because it'll transition into this particular chaos magic ritual you wanted to talk about. Your background, where you were someone that you were born in the Bronx, and you're in Boulder, Colorado now. And you went from, you worked in public education. I think you might have mentioned a couple other jobs you might have had, but I'm not 100% sure.
I was a gemologist after college. I taught diamond grading and precious stone identification at the Gemological Institute of America. So there's quite a varied background there. But now I'm just a full-time weird person.
Yeah, a full-time spooky woo-woo, which is a hell of a transition that I think a lot of folks, even people that you would think of as being you look at their Instagram or their social media presence, and the fact that they have their name attached to books and stuff like that. And you would think, oh man, this guy really made it. And then you realize, oh no, this person still works a day job. So it's a hard transition for anybody. But as you pointed out, your life has been full of a lot of these sort of magical and synchronistic moments that have led to a rather out of the ordinary outcome for you. You want to talk about that?
Yeah. And I mean, to humble myself, which is not easy for me to do. I mean, the only reason I'm able to be a full-time weird person is I inherited some money in 2015. Otherwise, I would still be working day jobs and, eking by as I did for many years before that happened. So that's made my path a little easier than some. But now I'm sort of free to just completely follow my obsessions. But this kind of transitions into the chaos magic ritual because I really had a somewhat higher profile, even a few years ago. I mean, I would, be a somewhat regular guest on Coast to Coast AM, which, brought me a large audience, once in a while. But I was a featured correspondent and editor at Reality Sandwich, which was once kind of a big counterculture online magazine that had reached 250,000 readers a month, which is not gigantic, but still. It was very big in festival culture and with chaos magic and psychedelics and all the kinds of things that you talk about. And then there was kind of a hostile takeover, and it was turned into something totally unsupportable, like a sort of by somebody from High Times magazine, into a kind of drug promoting website and so forth. So I was frustrated with, how few people were buying my books. My creative career operates at a lifetime 6-figure loss. And I'd kind of gotten disillusioned with chaos magic, because I was seeing that it could have good effects in like changing my psychology and things within me, but I was not seeing it moving the needle with outside events, like book sales and this kind of thing. So, and this was just like 2-3 weeks ago when I heard Mitch Horowitz on Coast to Coast talking about his new book, Practical Magic. And it begins with him referencing Parsons, saying that he thought like the project of magic was kind of a failure because anybody that won a war did so through simple means. And he felt like magic was just we hadn't arrived at like a simple enough kind of formula. And that kind of sparked my interest. And then a whole bunch of sort of realizations began to kind of spark in my mind. That that if we looked at who are the two most successful chaos magicians of our time, you can make a good case for Steve Jobs and Donald Trump. And the reason I mentioned Steve Jobs is if you read any of his biographies or just articles about him, people were constantly using a Star Trek term to talk about Jobs, that he had a reality distortion field.
Yeah.
Right. Now I call it an RDF to make it sound more scientific. And somehow he wasn't an engineer like, Zuckerberg and Gates, but he would ask for these things that engineers would all say was impossible. And he said, you will get this done in 6 months. And this reminded me of something that a Hermetic philosopher and magician I once corresponded with in Australia, Harold Kleeman. I've lost track of him, but he once told me, magicians don't request, they command. And so if we look at Donald Trump and Steve Jobs, they have some psychological things in common. They both have narcissistic personality disorder, malignant narcissistic personality disorder in the case of Donald Trump, the easiest psychiatric diagnosis of all time. And so basically you have a red hot kind of royal ego that feels completely free to command. And then I related that to things I was reading in you might, I don't know if you're familiar with Bernardo Kastrup, who's kind of a modern analytical idealist philosopher. And this has a lot of relationship to magic. So there are kind of three. So idealism is basically, and it goes back to Plato, and Jung was also an idealist, that everything is consciousness. So this is a very, it's in Hinduism. I mean, this is an archetypal philosophy, and I think is the correct.
It's the all is mind school.
Yeah, and it's and we'll get to the lawless part of it very, very shortly. Is that this I think is the way to view the world. It resolves the paradoxes of quantum mechanics. They're kind of three most prominent, as far as I know, idealist philosophers of today that really integrate it with science. And that's Bernardo Kastrup, who has PhDs in both computer engineering and analytical philosophy, worked at CERN, for example. And then we have Donald Hoffman, who wrote the book, The Case Against Reality. And he is
okay,
at
I know
MIT,
that one.
right? And then we have Campbell, who, My Big Toe, and so forth. And they all, there's a lot of, they have their differences, but they're kind of like the leading figures in this idealist movement that is increasingly acknowledged by many scientists, because they're able to completely defeat the position of physicalism so effectively that, I don't think anybody would even come forward to try and debate that with Kastrup at this point. But one of the things that Kastrup said, and he describes himself as lumpen, that's his own adjective in his Dutch accent, because he doesn't have a whole lot of paranormal or magical experiences himself, but he's kind of open to those as explainable by analytical idealism. But he kind of derides magic, and he talks about it as ego control fantasies. And I thought that was a very effective diss. If you think about things like The Secret and so forth, that people might dress it up in this, new age spiritual clothing, but basically it was like, or New Thought, that basically these were just ego control fantasies. And
occultism as power fantasy is what it is.
Right,
yeah.
Right. And there is truth to that description for sure.
Oh, absolutely.
And, that became part of my souring on magic. But then he also had a more formal way of explaining why it's so difficult, even if everything is consciousness, that basically the way we exist as individual psyches is that we are all alters. And there's even strong evidence of this, like in the sense of the alters of somebody who has DID, dissociative identity disorder. And therefore, to have an alter, there's a dissociative boundary separating me from your psyche, or otherwise there'd be a massive telepathic invasion of privacy, and I would know everything going on in you and so forth. And sometimes that happens when that dissociative boundary is broken between two people, and they do have a telepathic experience, So, but there's even a stronger dissociative boundary between human consciousness and the more mechanized, habituated, impersonal consciousness that runs the physical processes of the universe, of what shows up as, scare quotes, the physical world on, as Kastrup would describe it, the dashboard of our senses and our consciousness and so on. And so I had already had similar thoughts in that I found that with magic, where because I created my own philosophy called dynamic paradoxicalism, that basically it's like what Niels Bohr once said, the opposite of a profound truth is another profound truth. And the idea of dynamic paradoxicalism is you acknowledge that paradox, and now you have a sliding or dynamic relationship between those poles. And one of the most obvious of these dynamic paradoxes is you create your own reality, which New Age fundamentalists and New Thought folks from, even the turn of the century adamantly insist on, and outside reality creates you, which they are in denial of, because so many factors are out of our control. We're speaking in English. I didn't invent that language, neither did you, and yet it has a big effect on my thinking, my sense of time, and so forth.
Heidegger referred to that as the thrownness. We are thrown into a world that we have so little to do with, where it's like you're here. And there's a whole host of factors that happened before you got here that will impact every facet of what you do afterwards.
Exactly. And so the way I thought about this before reading Kastrup is that a lot of magic depended on the scale and the dynamic fluidity of the system to which we're trying to apply magic. So, for example, if I'm going to a party where there's just going to be 4 or 5 people, and I'm thinking before I go there, everyone's going to hate me. Or conversely, I'm thinking everyone there is going to love me. Well, there's an excellent chance I'll create a self-fulfilling prophecy, because I'm approaching 4 other agents who are conveniently the same species as me. I'm going to be in an enclosed space with them, and there's a small number of them. And therefore, these 2 magical acts of these 2 inner attitudes expressed in English thoughts in my mind are likely to have a substantial effect. However, if I am a Jew in Warsaw, Poland, and the Nazis are rolling into town, you create your own reality would say, just focus on how well you'll be treated by the Nazis. But that's probably not going to work because now we have a much bigger system with a lot more people in it who already have a hardened ideology and a hardened attitude toward Jews or whatever. And I should probably just get out of Dodge or Warsaw in this case, right? Because I'm less likely to have an effect. Or if I want to change, but let's say I'm standing above one cloud and I want to do cloud bursting. Well, maybe that will work because the water vapor in the cloud is almost in a state of quantum indeterminacy where just a little push in one direction or another could cause it to rain. However, if I want to eliminate all environmental pollution on Earth, now we have something with much more temporal momentum that's already a hardened reality in the psyche of 8 billion and so forth. Going to be much harder to change. Even harder to change would be to change the orbit of planets in another solar system on the other side of the galaxy and so forth. So the further you get from your own psyche, there's a dissociative boundary between me and my own unconscious, but I can probably break through that if I do affirmations and spells and things that, because that's a dissociative boundary that's so close to me. And then I may be able to influence some other few people that I know, for better or worse. But if I want to do something like increase book sales, now I'm dealing with members of my own species, but the dissociative boundary is much stronger because I'm talking about people I don't even know. Right?
And also a whole host of, everything from Amazon's recommendation algorithm to various advertising methods, commerce. The fact is, if people, if an economy is tanking, you're going to sell less books because people don't have disposable income. There's a million facets that go into this.
Right. Things that are just outside of my control, and they're going to be hard for me to magically influence because we don't see much evidence of that unless we're talking about somebody like Donald Trump, who's massively shifting the global economy for the worst based on notions he came up with in the 80s and so on. I listened to Mitch Horowitz, and I really have to praise the guy because there are very few. I'm a very hypercritical person, and he's one of the few people I can listen to, and especially on the subject of Magick, where my bullshit detector, the needle doesn't move at all. He really seems to have the humility and the careful thinking to not make unsupported assumptions and so on. And he came up with a liturgy because as a chaos magician, and Horowitz actually coined the term anarcho-magician because chaos magic even comes with, I haven't read Peter Carroll, but it can still come with its own implicit ideology. And I don't follow any ideology at all. To me, that's the idea of chaos magic, but he calls that anarcho-magic. Anyway, he recited a quick, you want me to acknowledge the glitch and go from there?
Well, we had a bit of a stuttering and off and on with technical problems. We think we figured out what it is. But if you could just do a brief recap that you were hearing Mitch Horowitz, he was discussing practical magic. He had this anarcho chaos magic liturgy that you wanted to get into.
Right. And what in general, just in case there might be redundancy here, but better to recap than leave out something essential. What really spoke to me from Mitch's book, Practical Magic, his latest, was a realization that one had to really own one's desire and not try and dress it up and make it more lofty. And it relates to Crowley's true will idea. And also I felt empowered to do this because I felt my true desires are moral as far as I can tell. And so therefore I should feel uninhibited in owning those, like desire for more book sales, and not just say I'm trying to heal humanity or, further evolution and stuff like that, but to get really specific, because to cross that dissociative boundary, one needs a kind of sharp, aggressive edge, the idea that magicians command, not request, and therefore specificity and assertiveness might actually be the key to make this work, a key that I had not ever fully employed before. And Mitch gave a very telling example of how to own that actual desire. because he was an advisor somehow for a reality show. It sounds like a very tacky premise for a reality show, but I guess we expect that from reality shows, that involved 18-year-old young women who were obese and were going to be assigned personal trainers to reach their personal best or whatever before they went to college. And he was talking to one of these young women, and he asked her, well, why do you want to lose all this weight? And she said, for my health. And his immediate response was, and I love how candid he was and confrontational, even though he's very humble and polite otherwise, he said, that's bullshit. You're 18 years old and you're about to go to college. You're not doing it for your health. You're doing it because you want to look hot. And there's nothing wrong with that. And that was super liberating for that young woman, because now she located her true desire, and instead of censoring it and trying to make it conform more to like ideals of society or something, she got to own her actual desire, and that allowed her to succeed with the program, apparently. So that was just a setup. And you know, normally as a chaos magician, I would never use anybody else's liturgy, but he came up with one that struck me as having just the right level of like aggressiveness, as something that anybody can use as a preamble to their magical petition. And here it is. God of wishes fulfilled, God of the outsiders, God of reciprocity, God of retribution, grant what I ask, which I am prepared to pay for. So I immediately adopted that preamble, wrote a very carefully edited, short magical petition, and began reciting that at least once a day. And almost immediately there were really uncanny effects. Like one was a hardcore physical anomaly. So I wrote that out as an iPhone memo so that it would be convenient, you know, at night or in the morning or whatever. And an image that was not a photo, not an emoticon, but a fully realized computer graphic image was added to that memo without my participating. Now, I had created a little efficient word sigil to represent the whole petition, and I called it Beacon 67. 67 is my present age. So it was kind of owning, yeah, I'm 67, but I know more than I ever have before. I've got the value of what I have is more valuable than it ever was before. So I'm kind of like owning that. And the idea of the beacon is obvious. I want to like transmit it like a lighthouse and, you know, send my petition out into the world, and with it, my content. And the image that appeared on the bottom of this iPhone memo was a lovely image of a lighthouse with golden rays coming out 360 degrees around it. Now, did somebody hack my iPhone? If so, they would probably want my credit card info not to add an appropriate image to this memo. I don't think that Apple has created some sort of program that will add images it thinks that are appropriate to your personal memos, because that would totally spook the hell out of people that, you know, that something was reading them and, you know, all this kind of stuff. There's no way of explaining it. It's just, as far as I know, it's just a complete anomaly, but it seemed like a hardcore paranormal effect. And it was as if the cosmos was saying, message received, and transmission is now online. And then almost immediately, there were real world additional effects, in that for years I had wanted to reconnect. I've just gotten 2 emails from him. I'll have to read just within the last 2 minutes, from a guy named Richard Grossinger. He's given me permission to talk about him publicly on this podcast, who is the founder of North Atlantic Books and now has his own print through the giant in the kind of metaphysical field, you know, Inner Traditions. And I wanted to reconnect with him. He took kind of a personal interest in me years ago, and originally North Atlantic Books was going to publish my Singularity book. But it felt a little bit unseemly to reach out to him because he took a personal interest in me, and I knew I would just be contacting him because of like, hey, here I am, help me out. It didn't feel right somehow. But then, like just a couple of days after I started this magical petition ritual, I get a personal message from him asking if I would be willing to write a blurb for his new book, and, you know, and read it and look for typos. And I decided given the aggressiveness theme, to give him more than what he asked for and to do a line edit of the first 38 pages, which is kind of a presumptuous thing to do to an 82-year-old polymath genius and writer, somebody who's written like at least 40 books and so on. But I did it anyway because I was confident in my editing abilities. And he really liked that. Within, days of our becoming reacquainted, he had me, he was telling me, he said I could even say this on air, that, there's now more than 9 out of 10 chance that a new edition of my book will be published by Inner Traditions. That's a big event for me because my books have all been self-published up till that point. And then another key synchronicity, there were a few of them, but I'm just going to mention the highlights, was I didn't mention anywhere, as Gandalf, at least in the movie, says to Frodo, keep it secret, keep it safe. And Horowitz talks about that universal principle of you don't share your magical rituals unnecessarily. So I had posted nothing on social media or anything about this ritual I'm doing. Only a few friends knew. And yet, and somewhere in my talks or whatever, I've mentioned chaos magic a little, but then I was contacted by you saying, would you be willing to come on a podcast and talk about chaos magic? And that was days after this ritual started. I seem to get confirmation from the universe that like, hey, this is the way to go. And it's very simple, but it has a different slant than I've ever used before of like, be aggressive and assertive about what you really desire. But hopefully that will be something ethical and of benefit to others, as I think my content is. And that's what may really allow it to work.
The idea of stripping yourself of unnecessary pretensions when it comes to what your intents are. The idea of saying,
and adding specificity, like specifics, how much money you want to make, how, what kind of book sales do you want, and so forth.
That's fascinating. And, you discuss the idea of reaching those moments of sort of high synchronicity or reaching these areas where the vortex comes in and you're able to have all these. And I think, at least in my personal experience, I've had a lot of that in the same way where sometimes you are able to see a lot of these synchronistic connections that maybe you don't notice at first. But I think another example of that is that those kinds of moments can be engaged through ritual. You are able to, by doing, like example, you made a petition, you had the sigil, you did this exercise where you repeated it over again, and it engaged whatever sort of mechanism that is involved to allow those changes to happen. And sometimes, like you said, this couple days there, things happen quick. The very you will get almost immediate confirmation of, hey, you're in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think another part of it is that and locating what your desires really are. That's part of it. Is Jeffrey Kripal, who I know slightly. Talks about the etymology of telepathy, that path meant pathos and emotion. And that what we find from all parapsychological experiments is that if you set up like Zinner cards or whatever to where people are just bored from doing it, that all the effects go down. That where paranormal things happen the most is where there's high emotion. Like, the woman, the 100-pound woman who lifts a 4,000-pound car off her child, or, the mother whose child is in trouble and she senses that remotely and so forth. These are events with high emotion and like survival urgency and this kind of thing. And so you want to bring the emotional intensity into it. Whereas some others, like, but there are people who talk in all kinds of other directions, like Anton, what's his name? The Satanist guy, Anton LaVey.
Oh, Anton LaVey.
LaVey, right.
Yeah, LaVey.
We talk about, you have to kind of like not care about the result. There are all kinds of different attitudes. And I don't want to overgeneralize from my particular experience because, a lifetime of intention has gone into it. But I mean, this is what worked for me. It's one person's report. But another part of that petition is, and I'm willing to do the work. And then I immediately found it was almost like the Sorcerer's Apprentice. That suddenly I've got to edit his 227,000 word book. I was also editing the the sequel to Parallel Journeys, and now I've got to do all this stuff to republish. I'm overloaded with work now.
Well, Magick, I would say Magick, even though Magick does have the appearance of maybe something from nothing or the free lunch, I think anyone who is an honest practitioner, like I said, we mentioned a lot of Magick can fall into the idea of sort of ego, power fantasy of these are actions just to ingratiate a small-minded sense of I want something to happen and I want to feel like I'm in control of my destiny and blah, blah, blah. But I think most honest practitioners, not only do the results from your practice turn into a lot of extra work, but sometimes you'll find that you will do Magick for something that you're like, man, you know what? This was not actually, either this wasn't worth it or this would have been easier to do almost any other way.
Right. I came up with the saying like 35 years ago or something, just for myself, that magic is something to reach for when you've gone to the furthest limits of ordinary means. But I kind of felt like I had. I mean, obviously there were infinite number of things I could do to advance publishing, but I only have so many hours in the day and only so much enthusiasm for that. But I want to point out 3 elements involved in my one anecdotal experience. One is something that Horowitz emphasizes, which is be alert so that and open-minded, so you recognize the help when it comes. That kind of prompted me to recognize that this personal appeal from Grossinger might be the help, even though I was being asked to help. And I'm just, as a personality, more comfortable helping others than asking them out of the blue for help. So that gave me the opening. And then a second thing is that the magical ritual may change your own attitude and keep you more focused and willing to work. So it made me willing to do this line editing thing. And then a third thing is kind of third force, or where you actually get signs that cannot be causally explained, like the image that appeared or the sudden request to be on a podcast to talk about chaos magic so close to the event, where it does seem like you are getting help from the cosmos in some way.
And that also,
it's not just your own efforts or a change in your attitude.
Oh yeah. Well, and that always goes back to the old Crowley quote of the man doing his true will as the inertia of the universe. That's there. Right. There is a genuine phenomena, at least with a lot of practitioners, particularly the Thelemites, the people that do go in on true will, but even with a lot of chaos magic people, there is that feeling of like when you're doing, it's like when you're following your own true north, when you're upfront and you're direct and almost single-minded about what you're trying to get, it will seem like there are hidden assistants that are going to come out of the woodwork to make this happen. And I think to a certain extent, that same phenomena you're talking about with that personal reality distortion field is something that a lot of the time it's a matter of you're able to increase that through means of trying to, like you said, find what explicitly you want. And then we can get into the sort of ideas of like, well, what methods are more effective than others and things like that. But I think we've all had moments, even non-spooky people, I'm sure have had moments where it's like, something happened. And that is when I knew, however unlikely it might have been from an outside perspective, I knew that I was doing the right thing and I was going to get what I was after.
Yeah. And I think part of it that can make you like a more powerful magnet for attracting those forces is something I would call congruence. Like if you really have located your true desires and you're an authentic person, then, and this is something that people can thin slice very quickly. Are you like a congruent person? Are you who you say you are? And, are you walking your own talk? Or are you kind of a phony and not congruent? And I think if you're congruent, if you just even see it as lines of force, I think you're more likely to push through that dissociative boundary. So it's very important to get yourself into that place where you can really, Horowitz talks about something like a chief aim or something, he even has an acronym for it. If you really have a chief aim and you're really behind it, then that's when you can really make it happen and get those mysterious helpers appear from nowhere.
I think to a certain extent too, there is that's why so much of magical traditions do rely on, and the yogic traditions are really big on this too. But the notion of like, you have to start with yourself. You have to start with all of the bullshit that you've got going on, because you don't even know. You might approach one of these traditions, or say, or you wake up one day and decide, all right, I found this business card. It says spooky woo woo. I'm going to go be a magician. But you don't even know enough about yourself to really start that until you start pulling some of your own bullshit out. You're very profoundly influenced by the Jungian model. So, when you talk about getting, owning your shadow, making it, yourself aware of it, finding the archetypal expressions that are going on inside, within and without, those are those are incredibly important to deciding what are you really about? What are my true aims? Because in the same way, the example of the woman or the young girl that said, like, I want to do it for my health. And it's like, there might be a case where you say that and it's like, yeah, this is for your health. This is for you. And you want to, do that. But a lot of the times we are so possessed by a certain level of societal, you said you talked mass psychosis through this series that we're going to get into a little bit, but there's a kind of societal sickness of all of the foibles and neuroses that we develop as a response to living in the world that we do, that you might not really know what your motivation is for something. It's like, I might want this, or like, bad example. It's like, man, it would be really nice to have that Maserati across the road. But you start thinking about what your motivations are and you realize, it's like, well, I don't actually want this car. What I want is the things that I associate with it. I want the sense of freedom, the sense of affluence. I want the status of having the nice car, those sort of, and then you realize it's like, well, it's got what my desire in this case has very little to do with what the object of the desire actually is.
Right. You've got to get them congruent, but also, as you suggested, congruence within yourself. So if you have inner complexes that you're not aware of, then and you discover a magic amplifying technology or technique, you may create disastrous unintended consequences, because those unexamined inner motives will be operating and amplified by the technology and create results you didn't anticipate. And we see this play out perfectly in the 1950s sci-fi classic Forbidden Planet, because you have this man who's got an Electra complex going on with his daughter, and there's this extraterrestrial technology that's been created by a species called the krill, I believe, who that sort of amplifies your psychic intentions. And so he doesn't realize his own complex, that he's obsessively possessive of his own attractive daughter. And when these astronauts show up, some of whom are classically square-jawed, handsome, 1950s astronaut
real
types,
chads,
right, exactly. And so what happens is monsters of his own id come out, amplified by this extraterrestrial technology that caused the extinction of that species, because they had opened a Pandora's box they weren't prepared to handle either, and start attacking the astronauts to keep them away from his daughter and so forth. So this is the kind of thing that can happen if you haven't integrated your own shadow and have complexes operating within you. So you think you have one desire, but beneath it is really, I think I want to save America, but really what I want is to be glorified. And I want everybody to, talk about me and so on. And this kind of thing. And then you get unfortunate things happen.
Another good pop culture example. Well, I guess, actually, did I get this from you? Shit, hold on. I'm sorry. Colin Wilson's The Mind Parasites, and the Philosopher's Stone, which I read not too long ago, and then I unexpectedly found a copy of it for sale for like 50 cents. But that's another perfect example of there's these, and like a very I like it as metaphor, because these are very explicitly like spooky semi-Lovecraftian entities that, spoiler alert for anybody who hasn't read the books, turn out to actually be embodiments of, to a certain extent, of the unconscious id and turmoil that is within the collective human psyche.
You could have gotten the mind parasite thing from me because, in fact, there's a category drop-down menu on my website, and one of the major categories I write about is mind parasites, and I do reference the Colin Wilson novel of ideas called The Mind Parasites. But that, if we open that can of worms,
we're going to be here all night.
we'll yeah, exactly. So we
That's
better
okay.
stay off of that one.
All right. Well, we can always have you on again. But we've been dancing around it a little bit. And it's going to really disappoint because I don't know if you know, our viewer base is like 99.999% hardline Trumpers who just,
really?
No.
Okay.
No, that's a joke.
That's a joke.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sorry. No, it's very safe to say, like, I like to think that we have a diverse fan base as far as the people that listen. But if our Discord is any indication, and I think magic and occultism in a lot of ways it definitely has a bend toward extremes in political sense, where you'll find like there's hardcore leftists on one end, and then there's like the spooky woo-woo right-wingers are all like esoteric Hitlerism, you know? But I think in general, occultism and a lot of this, I guess because it's wrapped up in like new age stuff, I think a lot of that does bend to the left in general. But I did want to get into this because you, right as preparation for this, you were like, hey, this is the first part of my Trumpocalypse series. And it's 5 videos, but because you do one right after the election, right? But initially it was 4 articles. And then on your YouTube, you read them and have sort of additional updated commentary. Because the Trumpocalypse came from the first election, right?
Right. Yeah, I on Reality Sandwich, but also on my website, I published something like 30 articles on the Trumpocalypse. I might have been the first person to use that term. I don't know, but I guess it just occurred to a lot of people at the same time. But I have a perspective that offends both sides because I see a mass psychosis going on both the left and on the right. And I see them as synergistic and feeding each other. And just as an overview, the psychosis on the left is more annoying, and on the right, it's far more dangerous. And I can expand on why that's the case. But basically, if we start with Trump, or we can start wherever you want on that topic.
So your contention through a series of these articles is that Trump is an embodiment of the American shadow in the Jungian sense. And that he's almost in the same way that you talked about him as being one of those that presents that sort of reality distortion field. Because, and I didn't know this until you said it, but the idea of he actually growing up had influence from a certain preacher or reverend or whatever you'd want to call it that was very big in the sort of New Thought movement. That idea
Norman Vincent Peale.
There you go.
That was his family taking him to see Norman Vincent Peale every Sunday.
And somebody who was a very big proponent of that sort of New Thought and the idea that your thoughts influence reality. And I think that gets tied up in sort of prosperity gospel ideas and stuff like that. But it might be that seed influence of how someone who is by all accounts an unhinged personality, somebody who is scrupulous and very obsessed with themselves and obsessed with grabbing power, could somehow become so influential and so widespread because he's all the dirty, seedy parts of a collective sort of American personality type, I guess.
Right. Like I just heard a woman like on the news, or maybe this was just when the campaign was going on, like, a couple months ago, they were interviewing and she said like, Trump is just like me. And like, based on the way she said it, she was saying like, he's down and dirty and like disses people and talks trash. And like, so do I. So it made him very lowest common denominator relatable to her. But, I'm not comparing Trump to Hitler. That's J.D. Vance's job. But when people would ask Jung, who actually met Hitler, how did Hitler control the German psyche? And he said, no, Hitler didn't control the German psyche. He was the German psyche. It is possible for someone to personify a collective shadow, and that is the unique relationship. And that's why it's so hard for anybody else to do Trump, as many people have tried. And even in other countries, other populists have tried to emulate him with less success, is that somehow he was, in an uncanny way, chosen to play this role. And here's some of the evidence that there is an uncanny magical event going on, a fateful event that you cannot explain causally. So there was a television series from the 1950s called Trackdown, in which there's a Western town, and a con man named Walter Trump shows up and this was aired on CBS in 1958 in an episode titled The End of the World, and where an actor named Lawrence Dobkin plays the role of Walter Trump. And he puts on a long robe and holds a tent meeting in the town of Talpa, and he tells the townspeople that a cosmic explosion will rain fire on the town, and that he is the only one, only I can fix it, remember that can save them from death. And then there's a ranger who tries to prove that he's a fraud, but he tells that everybody, you must pay me money because I'm going to build a wall around the town and prevent the death, the American carnage, as Trump might refer to it.
It feels very on the nose.
It is. I mean, like if you made this up, like people would say, like, this is over the top. Come on. Then there was a 19th century book series featuring a character called Baron Trump, the very name of Trump's son with Melania, and his guide is named Don. And that's resurfaced a lot of conspiracy theories about Trump and his youngest son, Barron, who's 6'7", which almost, seems to go with the idea of like, what is going on with these people? And there was it even reignited talk about time travel and stuff. So there was a writer named Ingersoll Lockwood. That sounds like a fantasy character, Ingersoll Lockwood. Like, it almost sounds over the top if you had him as a gothic vampire, Anyway, and his 1888 publication of Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Journey and 1896's The Last President. I mean, I'm getting goosebumps just reading this. It's so amazing. Lockwood's stories became a hot topic of conspiracy theories. Some of them claiming that the Trump family has a time machine. One user said pointed out that in a book called Baron Trump's Marvelous Underground Journey, there's a 10-year-old boy named Baron Trump who has a mentor named Don, who is a rich man who lives on Fifth Avenue in New York City. Well, where is Trump Tower? It's right next door to Tiffany's, I think on 57th and Fifth Avenue. And he and Don traveled to Russia to find a portal to a magical underground world. And the book's author lived in New York City, one conspiracy theorist pointed out, at the same time as Nikola Tesla. And so this is where they get the idea, and people have speculated that Nikola Tesla was a time traveler or something. I mean, I think these are people who are looking for literal mechanisms to explain the even more strange and hard to explain workings of the collective unconscious.
I do remember, I don't remember the quote itself, but the gist of it was something to the effect of like the problem with conspiracy theory, besides the multiple, but it's like one of the issues of conspiracy theorists is that they're always looking for a physical cause or a person they can point to or a group of people. But if you'd be forced to acknowledge the transpersonal aspect, and I think they were trying to hint at like archons and Cthulhuid tendrils, just beyond the veil. But there's the foibles of the human inner experience is just as scary in a lot of ways, if not more.
Right. I mean, I could imagine archons. I've even speculated about that behind this kind of thing. But the flaw in most conspiracy theories is that it comes down to a group of puppet masters, often anti-Semitically seen as Jewish or something, who are controlling everything. And this is so obviously nonsensical for a couple of reasons. One is I'm not aware of any human ego smart enough to control everything. If they were that smart, maybe they should control everything. And second, when we look out at the phenomenal world of current events, we don't find the one group of puppet masters doesn't add up, because everywhere we see competing spheres of power, China and the US are not being controlled by the same puppet masters. Even Google and Apple are not. They're competing with each other, and so on. So everywhere we see competing spheres of power, so the one group of common human ego puppet masters doesn't work. And the problem with conspiracy theories, which I've often dissed, even though my dad was a brilliant conspiracy theorist, but his conspiracy theories was backed by critical thinking and evidence, and he was able to predict the Kennedy assassination almost to the day. It was just based on the CIA with him, but he joined me in debunking 9/11 truthers. The problem with conspiracy theorists is that they massively suck at conspiracy theorizing. There really are conspiracy theories out there. It would be great to have people bring them out, but they just bring out really flaky ones that don't add up. And that actually helps conspiracies to be effective, because the phony conspiracy theories that are so ubiquitous act in the same way that, like, that fighter jets release this chaff of like little sheets of aluminum or something to confuse incoming radar of, missiles and this kind of thing. These phony conspiracy theories, QAnon et al., act like chaff. Like, we hear about so many conspiracy theories that we just give up on locating the real conspiracies that we need to locate. So anyway, but returning, I just got a little bit more on like Ingersoll Lockwood.
Please go on. Sorry.
Who said that one of the other uncanny things is that Baron Trump, Baron is short for the Germanic name Wilhelm Heinrich Sebastian von Trump, Troomp. And they saw that as, because, Trump is from a German family that was originally named Drumpf, but they changed their name to Trump, which means a trick winning card. I mean, talk about like name synchronicity. Of course, we can talk about my last name, Zap, that wasn't shortened at Ellis Island, as another weird name that has some kind of underlying mythos behind it. Jung had a name synchronicity theory, but for him to be a trick winning card, and for him to like win that first election, through the Electoral College, while Hillary got almost 3 million more votes and so forth, he embodies the trick winning card, and he is a trickster. And so it seems like this is the collective unconscious producing a character to personify the American shadow, to play out this drama where, America would in some ways get the president it deserves. And so it's really just this amazing process of how this happens. Oh, and there was one key thing I wanted to say about it that I make in this, in one of my more fanciful articles called, Take the Orange Pill, Trumpocalypse reveals that you live in a simulated matrix. Is my idea is that the matrix favors story intensifying characters because it wants novelty. And that's why I feel story structure is one of the best explanatory tools ever created for understanding life and how to have a good life. And I reference it constantly in my oracle. So think about this. This is our first reality show president. Well, when did the modern era of reality shows begin? It began with Survivor. And who was the survivor of the first season of Survivor? Well, it was a guy you love to hate named Richard Hatch, who was like a gay ex-military guy who was a manipulative asshole, basically. And what the story runners realized is that just like Darth Vader is the only real super compelling character of Star Wars, and that's why he's talked about the most,
He's got all the merchandise.
Right, exactly. And the one that would be the best to promote the series was the guy everybody loved to hate. And now we have a reality show president who is also that person that, people either love or love to hate. And so he's a story intensifying character as compared to the watered down PBS tote bag decaf presentation of Harris, who just seemed focus tested and so boring, even though I voted for her, thinking that mediocrity would be better than totalitarianism, but, was so not a story intensifying character, just like the two guidance counselor looking, vice presidents chosen by both Clinton and Harris that looked so much the same. They did a Saturday Night Live skit where they had them appear together to see if anybody could even tell them apart. And so Trump realized, and he's said it publicly, all publicity is good publicity, including negative publicity. And, I think he's some maybe influenced by Edward Bernays, the public relations genius, who said that if you really want to influence the public, you need to create disruptive events. And so this is the chaos magic of Donald Trump, is he creates chaos. And in that chaos, he's able to bring new things into being and take advantage of it, and is able to, in such an improbable way, get away with stuff that nobody else can get away with, as if his reality distortion field is so strong that it pushes out what should have been campaign and career ending event after event after event, especially the Planet Hollywood thing that would have taken down any other candidate. And something else that's not acknowledged about Donald Trump is, you remember how he dissed Jeb Bush as low energy Jeb Bush? Well, you can accuse Trump of many things. You can't accuse him of being low energy. Like other people who are personifications of a collective archetype, he has an uncanny vitality. He eats a diet that, he shouldn't even be alive as somebody who's almost going on 79.
The man just
I want him
runs
to
on.
stay alive because...
Well,
I wanted to stay alive at this point because I don't want J.D. Vance, who's got 100 times his IQ, as taking his place.
Doesn't have the charisma, though.
Right, doesn't have the charisma. He can't pull off Donald Trump. People just look at him and basically see what he is, a giant douchebag with a high IQ. So you've got to respect his uncanny vitality, the energy. He doesn't sleep much. He's tweeting, or truthing to 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. He lives on gallons of Diet Coke and cheeseburgers and stuff like that. And, but he's like the Duracell bunny or Energizer bunny. You just can't stop him. He just keeps coming at you. And this is what the guy, I forget his name, who actually wrote The Art of the Deal, the ghostwriter, has said about him, that his one real superpower was that he could just keep huffing and puffing and blow the house down. He would just overwhelm people with his, fire hose of bullshit, and until they eventually just gave in.
Yeah, and that's exceedingly easy to do when you come from a background where, one, you were taught from a young age, no, you just want it, you got to go for it. Or you also had an exceptionally wealthy family, which if I remember, his father was
Fred Trump.
Fred Trump. But he was definitely in the same boat, possibly more malicious and messed up than Trump, if that seems possible.
Definitely. Fred Trump seemed a real classic full psychopath. He was the one who trained him, you've got to be a killer.
I think to a certain extent, it's eventually in all cases, whether it's the last when he lost to Biden and stuff like that, that sort of no audacity is too great as to not be overcome by more audacity is sort of his MO, but eventually you will hit a wall and something will happen. And it's even if it is just the fact that he is an embodied being and eventually his body, it doesn't matter how many pills or whatever whatever go juice they shoot him up with to keep him lucid during his interviews or whatever. It's eventually he's going to die. But there always seems to be this a certain amount of that overwhelming bravado, that overwhelming self-assuredness that will at some point come against a wall.
Right. I mean, he has that magical congruence. He's really is, every bit as rotten on the inside as on the outside. You can't say he's inauthentic. and that comes across, and people, so you're dealing with like an authentic personality, whereas with Harris, you don't know who's behind the focus group tested facade. But but if you had to pick one thing that could bring down this, behemoth figure of the great orange goblin, whatever you want to call him, it would be crashing the economy. Because if anything could wake up people who have drunk the orange Kool-Aid, it would be when they see prices going up instead of down like he promised, because they may tune out all kinds of things on politics, and they're totally bored with facts and all that kind of stuff. They don't care about the truth, but the truth of what's coming out of their pocket to buy groceries is an undeniable, irreducible factor that can even wake up the possessed. So he's working on doing the very thing that,
sowing his own destruction, maybe.
Right.
Hopefully. Now that is a very, ultimately that's a material condition sort of argument, which goes into Marxism. And I have a lot of influence from Marx. I think like the bedrock of like the labor movement and organizing on that grounds, I think that's how we're going to get out of this mess. And I think to a certain extent, the failure of the Democratic Party is because of a staunch refusal to go that way. Like when the new left of the 60s into the 70s took hold, and labor, and then later and when Reagan comes around and really starts quashing unions as a whole, and our sort of working class consciousness gets kicked in the dirt repeatedly. I think that's kind of how we got here, because going into the notions of the mass psychosis of the left, and there's always going to be people that will squabble with terms with like liberals and Democrats aren't really left, but we're not going to go there. We're going to use, if we're saying there's a dichotomy of there's this person and this side, we'll just say left, right. But the issue of the mass psychosis of the left seems to be an infatuation with idpol, identity politics, to the point that they become almost self-parodying. And like you said with like Harris, that a lot of their opinions in this veneer is very focus tested and very oriented to saying all of the right things to the right people. But it's performative. It doesn't, even if you look at Democratic legislation, there's very little to back up the sort of, like, the cliche of, they'll talk about how bad police brutality is, and they'll all put on their fucking dashikis and kneel for the photo op, and then they won't do anything to address the problem.
And they also don't have the uncanny charisma. Like the one person who also moves the needle a bit is another blunt talking New York Jew like myself, Bernie Sanders. Who even at 84 actually will move the needle because they sense the total authenticity of him.
And the Democratic establishment actively work to sabotage him too.
Right. And I think the Democrats probably need like, a 6'4" ex-Navy SEAL trash talking guy, but who's actually like a moderate and has sane positions and some liberal things in his heart. That might be the only kind of populist candidate that can take this on, because
I think you need like not quite a militant in terms of like that sort of labor working class consciousness. But I think if you had somebody that was like a shit kicker that was like, yeah, I am more than willing to stand on the picket lines when the Pinkertons come, like somebody who was like, yeah, I don't, if the money, if Das Kapital doesn't like what I have to say, they can shove it, and then I think that would be honest, and it would resonate with that same sort of material conditions thing we're talking. When people see that prices are fucked up, when people see the economy's crashing, you need somebody who's going to say, listen, I hear your actual concerns. This is a genuine, real plan that we have shown in the past actually works. Organizing labor works. The reason you have an 8-hour workday as the standard is because people fought for it. I think that would be the way to go. I don't think you're going to win anybody over by trying to keep policy the same and just change the coat of paint. Now, I'm not saying it wouldn't do better, but I don't think it would win.
Well, so, my sympathies are with your point of view. However, I want to point out a couple of other things that go in a different direction. One is that many people and a great many of the people who voted for Trump and some of the people you wouldn't expect did it because they identify with predatory capitalism. They're not looking for like a socialist solution. And I was raised by a socialist. But they're like, I want to be rich like he is. He's telling me I can be rich too, and they were talking to some, low info voters like, well, when Trump was president, we got checks that with his name on it. He was clever enough to put his name on the check. So they may look at Trump and they're like, I don't want to get like, be in a labor union. I want to be another rich guy like Trump. And he is creating that image of success. And they haven't been talked down from that to realize that they really need a whole different system of economics. But another thing that's going on that points toward the next step may also be just as irrational and not the kind of like rational solution and candidate that you're suggesting, is that we are already seeing the effects of AI causing collective psychosis. And this is from narrow or weak AI in the algorithms of social media that are, I would argue, the greatest amplifier of collective psychosis ever invented so far. I think even worse ones are coming. But they are the ones, but it's those algorithms that were weaponized by Facebook and Instagram and TikTok, controlled by the Chinese, that have really amplified the collective psychosis, where if you have a dark obsession, including, eating disorders and things, it'll be like, oh, let me help pull you down this dark rabbit hole and make your psychosis more and more extreme. So this is what we have going on right now. And now when we add to that deep fakes, where a political candidate could publish ads and in a Hispanic demographic, morph their face to look 15% more Hispanic, because people are more likely to vote for somebody who looks more like they do, and this kind of thing. When you consider like what the advances in AI can do with this mass psychosis amplifying effect, now you have these wild card elements that cause people to choose things that are completely not in their best interests, like the kind of rational solution candidate you're talking about. So that's what I worry about.
That raises that's a very subtle example that I find that is a real head scratcher, in the idea of like changing it just enough, just a smidge. Like that kind of subtle method is one thing. What I think about though is that a lot of times these tools are weaponized by people who are a little stupid, because you can see from the last election when Elon Musk shared an altered deep fake sort of thing of Harris that people lapped up as thinking was genuine. And how much of that is just preaching to people who weren't going to vote for her anyway? Hard to say, but it's like, I think a lot of times that technology, like we're already seeing it being implemented. So it's interesting to think of how those are going to be subtly adjusted over time. Because right now they're just hammering, or at least the people that think that that's the way to go, they're just hitting it with a hammer and be like, let's be very blunt, very on the nose. But that's also, that's emblematic, I guess, of the sort of overall sensibilities of this administration. It's be loud, move fast, break shit. It's one of those where I do worry that you might be right, and that the whole notion of because the fact is, the reason that you're able to even talk about certain ideas in America, and this is shown because like I said, talk about when certain labor movement people get too loud, or when certain political talking, and I don't want to say talking heads because it sounds negative, but when certain political personalities are too dangerous to the establishment, you will watch them be silenced, whether through the legal apparatus or killing Fred Hampton in his bed, that sort of thing. The reason that you're able to talk, like I'm able to say stuff like, oh yeah, I think labor organization and stuff like that is the way to go, is because it doesn't represent a threat to the established order. There is a certain feeling of being locked in to, you've got Coke and you've got Pepsi, and that's it. But I think that the problem is that and this is one of the pushbacks I have to give with your mass psychosis on the left, right? It's not that I don't think that you're correct in a lot of your assessment, but ultimately the notions of like, well, you need to vote for the candidate that is going to be sensible business as usual, is that the business as usual sensible candidates over and over and over again without meaningful change is what led to the dark horse of a Trump campaign actually getting enough movement to get somewhere. Because like you know, everybody said it. I think Donald Trump didn't think he was going to be president. I don't think I don't think he thought he was going to be president this time. I think he was just like, well, it's the long shot. It's either this or like they're going to put me in an orange jumpsuit.
Right. We gave him a choice between jail and being president. And he's just like, I think I'd rather be president. So many of these efforts, you know, have unintended consequences. But the thing is that what I see going on is a bypassing of the rational mind in very effective ways. And this is what also happened in Nazi Germany. So, for example, Roger Stone, you know, the classic dirty trickster, political operative, even looks like the penguin
yeah.
Batman, right? You know, and he has a tattoo of Nixon on his back and all this kind of stuff. And he, you know,
I forgot about that.
Yeah, and you know, and like Roy Cohn, everyone should see the movie The Apprentice, because that is like the movie of this time. You know, I mean, it's amazing, you know, to show how Roy Cohn influenced him. And of course, Roy Cohn was a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde with his sexuality and this kind of thing. And so is Roger Stone, who I think Trump met through Roy Cohn. They were both friends of Nixon. And so Roy Cohn would have this ability that Trump has also to put like dirty images in your mind to gross you out about a person. Like when Roger Stone wanted to take down Elliott Abrams, who was once a very effective attorney general and then became the governor of the state of New York. And there was a prostitute scandal that was real, you know, but Roger Stone added a detail that he just completely fabricated, apparently. He said that the prostitutes reported that Abrams always kept his socks on. and puts an image in your mind of this like slightly gaunt, you know, pale figure, but with like black socks on and naked. And like, it just turns it into this garish cartoon you can't get out of your mind. And that's very effective. It bypasses rationality and in a kind of, you know, almost fairy tale like way. Or a Nazi caricature of Jews kind of way, you know, with those cartoons that Goebbels used so effectively. And then another example of Trump doing this is during the first debates in 2016 with Clinton, and she was late coming back from her break. And Trump said like, yeah, and like, you know, she went to the bathroom and like, I don't even want to think about what she was doing in there. Forcing you to think about what she was doing in there. Turning her into a kind of scatological cartoon through the power of suggestion.
Very subtle methods.
Right, exactly. But very effective, very lowest common denominator. And now when you have people who are so low info about what's going on, you know, and what the facts are, and by the use of constant repetition, you know, like the phrase, the Russia hoax, you know, which was not a hoax, you know, and I've taken Trump supporting friends of mine and like broken that down for them and made them shut up about it. But by the repetition of like Russia, the Russia hoax, to where it becomes like an accepted fact and people just start repeating that. So you have them so effectively bypassing your conscious mind. And that's what Trump will try and do with crashing the economy. And he's already predictably doing it. He's just like, oh, well, this is the Biden stock market.
This has nothing to do with all those tariffs I threw out. Yeah.
Right. No, yeah, forget about causality. You know, here's a scapegoat. And then it's also like Powell, the Fed chief, you know, he wrecked the economy, you know, and this kind of thing. So he's doing all these things that effectively bypass the rational mind, which is in a diseased state in most people anyway. And this is very troubling because it's extremely effective. And the people who have the collective psychosis on the left, they only create instant antipathy with people. They're dislikable. They they're basically like I think of them as church ladies in drag. They are more adamant and rigid in their ideologies. I can have a conversation with a Trump supporter. If I talk to like somebody completely possessed by woke ideology, they just shut down the conversation and walk away because you dared to disagree with them.
Well, I think it turns into a certain level of there becomes an increasingly absurd level of what's called in leftist circles, at least, the idea of purity testing, of making sure that you say all, and this is done in the more, like I said, people that align a little closer to what I think of in terms of like Marxist ideas and stuff like that, where it's like, well, do you have the right opinion on this, and 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 this? Okay, now we can talk.
Right.
And that's why I always talk, like the right in general is pulled further right by their most powerful and loudest, most charismatic entities, and they all sort of coalesce, where it's like even moderate Republicans right now are aligning with Trump, even when you tell them some of the batshit insane things that he's doing or saying. But what happens with left, and whether this is like, left in the simple American politics of like, Democratic liberals, progressives, or like it's super notable in like anarcho or communist or socialist groups, these people will find any reason to splinter into more and more factions. You have a meeting with 12 people and 4 groups will walk out by the end of it because they found enough that they could disagree on.
Right. And so this is why I say it's more annoying on the left, but far more dangerous on the right. And there's a real evolutionary model. I'm not a big follower of it, but if you're familiar with spiral dynamics, where there are these different, they call them memes for whatever reason, levels of like,
that's the color thing, right?
Development. The color thing, right? And so, and I think maybe it's orange, that one that actually reflects the Trump consciousness.
Oh,
that's
the
more
irony.
like Attila the Hun and all that kind of stuff. And so, but they represent an earlier level of patriarchal collective psychological development that can be much better organized. Just like in a street gang where there's a psychopath leader and everybody follows them and this kind of thing. Whereas the people on the left and most of the people who are like my friends and, countercultural folks, that they are on the level that Spiral Dynamics calls the green meme. And the green meme, because something we see constantly at work, especially in American politics, is what Heraclitus called enantiodromia, which is a tendency to oscillate between extremes. We get somebody who's too rational and too, civilized like Obama, and then we go to like, the Orange Goblin. And if people get sick enough of the Orange Goblin, hopefully they'll want somebody who's more rational and moderate afterwards, but we don't know. But the green meme is an enantiodromia rebellion from patriarchy, which is characterized by power hierarchies. And so the green meme is ineffective because it can't have a hierarchy. It can't organize itself. So I remember like Amy Goodman, talking overconfidently about the Occupy movement, that was the end of patriarchy and this kind of thing. And, and it wasn't, because nobody could be in charge. Just like I go to the rainbow gatherings and, nobody can be in charge. At most you're a focalizer of an individual thing. And that's great. No crazy boss takes over it and turns it into a cult. But the downside is it can take 2 weeks of people standing around in a meadow just decide where the next gathering is going to be. So they're so anti-hierarchical that nobody can be the boss of me. Nobody's opinion is better than anybody else's. They're so anti-hierarchical that they'll eat their own. They'll eat anybody who tries to be a leader of anything. And therefore, because they can't organize and they also don't have as many guns as the people on the other side, they're not as dangerous. They're as dangerous if you're a college professor. They can get you canceled over nonsense. But fascists are the ones who are able to take over countries. We don't see like woke folk taking over countries quite as much. So that's why the lower common denominator consciousness on the right is actually far more dangerous and effective.
But also, in a way, the lack of ability to organize meaningfully on the left, and to an extent here, like I'll throw the Democrats under the bus again. The fact that the supposed oppositional party to a lot of these things has proven themselves to be unwilling and ineffective to actually address the problems. I mean, right now we're 5 months into the Trump presidency, and we have watched the Democratic Party, by and large, like say we need to compromise, when they spent the whole of the campaign cycle telling us that Donald Trump was going to be the end of democracy and he's a deranged lunatic and you can't. It's like, so what's your solution? Oh, we'll work with him, you know? So what that says to the people on a baseline is that not only are you not able to organize amongst yourselves as individuals, but the people that might represent the leadership of your particular ideology and the boots on the ground in terms of like, these are the people that can make political changes. They don't give a shit about you. They don't care.
Right. I mean, that's what they should not have Chuck Schumer ever speak in public, because I mean, such a denatured mediocrity is apparent that it's embarrassing.
Absolutely.
So they just don't have the charisma, and also because they insist on woke casting. So we've tried 2 female candidates. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm a 3rd-generation feminist in my family. I voted for Hillary and I voted for Harris. And I would gladly have a woman president, but I'm not representative of the American populace. That's why I say we need a trash-talking 6'4" ex-Navy SEAL to come in to be the next presidential candidate.
If Harris had shown herself of being capable of actually winning an election at any point before the Democratic establishment threw her in front of us and said that's your option, maybe you would have done a little bit better too. And like you said, there is definitely, I agree with you 100% in that there is definitely a need for the oppositional answer to Trump. You need someone who has that word you used, the vitality, that real, you need a bit of a blowhard, someone who is going to say like, this is a mess. It's this guy's fault. It's these people's fault. And if you want it fixed, you can't keep electing these folks. But right now we have that, we have that version of it that is sort of defanged, in that the idea of they'll basically, the only thing they have to offer is that we are not the critical threat to democracy. And like, I think I heard you say it when I was going through the videos, but you're not the first one. The only thing that's stopping Trump from being a totalitarian dictator is his own embarrassing level of laziness and incompetence.
Right. I mean, and that's fortunate. But somebody who really hit the nail on the head is the very oddly self-named Charlemagne the God, who said when it was Biden was the candidate, he said he doesn't have major character energy. That really hit the nail on the head, because that was my whole idea from 2016, is that the story intensifying character is the one most likely to win. And Elon Musk said something similar in a tweet back when they were still called tweets. He said that the most unlikely outcome, especially if ironic, is the one most likely to occur. It is that there is a part of the matrix that wants novelty, and therefore it wants major story characters. And Harris is just not a major story character. Like, you would cast her as like, the superintendent of a large school district in California, but not as a president.
The only thing I was going to add to that is that I think to a certain extent, hearing that made certain things click. And it's one of those, especially in my position where I look at myself, it's like, yeah, I'm trying to put out knowledge and think like interesting things about the occult world and hopefully inspire people. But at the end of the day, I'm an entertainer. And I was just thinking, it's like, man, there's a reason that certain personality types definitely rise to the top, even whether it's in like influencer culture or YouTube or the occult sphere. It's like certain, you'll find yourself seeing people that's like, how the hell is this person so well known when they're just god awful? And you realize it's like, well, maybe there's something to this whole novelty thing.
Right. And look at celebrity culture. So, I mean, one of the most prophetic movies ever made, Idiocracy, that the president is like a 6'8", like
he's
black
Terry Crews
alpha action figure. And his name is something like Hector Mountain Dew Camacho, and because in a dumbed down culture, that's what you need, is some kind of red hot celebrity that like appeals to people's lowest common denominator level of consciousness, because that's what they can't be bothered to try and understand policy positions and all that kind of stuff. They're just like, that guy's cool, I'm voting for him, he's rich, he's going to make me rich.
So really the Democrats just need to put a couple people up there with like an assault rifle on the podium and be like, we're going to get them.
Right. They're going to need, I hate to say it, but they'd be most likely to win with like a white male, alpha, trash talking, charismatic, good looking guy. I mean, and to some extent, that's why people have even thought that Gavin Newsom, because he looks like such a movie star and he's 6'3", but he's got too much baggage, but he's a great debater, and he goes at you, he'll take on anybody in a one-on-one. But it's got to be somebody who can really pull that off. But you're still resorting to black magic.
Do you worry that to a certain extent it's the idea of, which is almost what the Democrats keep talking, because if you look at it now, they say like, we need to shut up about progressive policies, we need to stop, we need to not let the far left influence our policies and our talking points. And it's like, well, you weren't listening to a lot of them to start with, because like I said, largely performative actions. But do you worry that this is an attempt to appeal to a mentality on the right with the hopes of maybe winning over people who by and large are sort of locked in on their opinions, where it's like, I know in my area, there are a lot of people that you can tell who they are voting for everything based on about 3 questions. And one of them is, who'd your dad vote for? So it's like, these are people that are locked into a mentality of like generational ideology of, we vote for the person with the elephant next to their name. Do you worry that maybe this attempt at black magic, as it were, this way of trying to thrill them with a loud jumping up and down personality is maybe just going to fall flat because people that are more liberal aren't quite so swayed by that?
Yes. I worry about a lot of things, but definitely that, because I want to point out that I suck at social engineering. I'm an introverted thinking type, so I'm better at analyzing deep patterns than knowing how to run a campaign or what's going to work, because everything I'm saying absolutely could backfire. And so you're right. I don't know what the solution is. Right.
But in psychical terms, you're like, this is kind of what you need, which, I like I said, I respect it. I think you're like, listening to it, there was stuff that I'd want to push back on, but I think by and large, you aren't wrong in your assessment. And there is something to be said about the massively misinformed and out to lunch electoral base that we have, where you would have an entirely different world if the vast majority of us showed maybe 15% more interest in politics and just 15% more critical thinking skills. But that's a massive leap for a lot of people.
Yeah, good luck with pulling that off. I mean, that's what I would like to expand, but it doesn't seem to be happening. Quite the reverse devolutionary trend seems to be at work. And I don't like H.L. Mencken, but he did say one thing that really holds up. No one ever went broke overestimating the crassness of the American people. The Democrats have underestimated that and tried to appeal to their reason and their critical thinking and policies that would be to their advantage. But if you want to win elections, you may need something more crass. But I don't know if that really solves any problem, because maybe that person will turn into the next demagogue, once they're in power. I don't have a solution. And it could be that this is all whistling past the graveyard, because the thing that's really going to affect things, and probably even sooner than climate change, will be AI. And so while we're debating how to resolve what might be irresolvable political problems that are being exacerbated by narrow AI, meanwhile, we've got this gargantuan factor looming above us that may make all of this talk seem irrelevant.
Very true. Very, very true. That I think on another quote that you brought, I can't remember who you said you got it from, but the idea of sort of compartmentalizing your days, of what's the best that you can do from when you wake up to when you go to bed. And the idea of when in the face of catastrophe and all of these potentials of things to go horribly wrong, there's a certain extent of, man, the things that the thing that you're worried about isn't even going to be a factor. What you completely missed the technological meteor that is AI, just waiting in the wings to completely knock everything off the table, or some other horrible event. I mean, like right now, Pakistan and India are getting into it, and that could very easily set off a nuclear strike. And who knows? It's one of those 2 hours from now when I'm going, man, that interview went really well, and then everything's changed.
Right. Well, I think you ended up. I'm so glad you brought that up, because this is like the one antidote to the insanity, the mass insanity that I can think of to offer people. Maybe it's even a good note to end on. It came from Dale Carnegie, and he said you should live in day-tight compartments, and it was part of a complex analog he created that, being on ocean-going ships had a very high fatality rate until they came up with the technology of having separate watertight bulkheads, so that if you got one hole in the ship before you had separate watertight bulkheads, the whole ship would fill up with water and you're dead. And ship sailing was like a horrible experience before that. One 19th century observer said it was like being in prison with the high probability of drowning thrown into the bargain, and you were seasick all the time. And, it wasn't the romantic thing that, we think of when we see
technology for preserving food wasn't good either. So you were very likely living off of rations or food that didn't have a great shelf life. Yeah. It's all kinds of.
There's a reason why they had to give them grog, why they had to, by law, that they were entitled to be drunk all day long, basically, and give them all this rum, because it was the only way you could keep people, willing to participate at all. But in any case, and the Titanic did have those watertight bulkheads, but the iceberg, punctured a critical number of them. But he said, live your life in day-tight compartments where you're just focusing on what you can do from getting up in the morning to bedtime. And so this is what I've had to do to keep my sanity in the face of the last election. Is it turns out, besides my enormous sense of self-importance, it turns out, and despite the 5 videos I made, it turns out I have surprisingly little effect on world history. And so I'm just trying to do the best job I can from bedtime, from waking up in the morning till bedtime. And that would be my job and my position in life. Regardless of if there's World War III, if there's a zombie apocalypse, an AI apocalypse, or whatever. And so therefore you center yourself in like what you can do. So Stephen Covey, 7 Habits of Highly Successful People, another one, kind of self-help guy like Dale Carnegie, talked about, he had one very interesting concept, and that was the circle of concern and then the circle of influence. So the circle of concern is like everything going on with Trump and the world economy and all that kind of thing. And that's a very big circle. And then there is the much smaller circle of influence of what I can actually control. Like right now, what I can control is like trying to put my thoughts together well for this podcast. And when that's done, I'll be trying to like do some other things on my to-do list and try and do them well. People who are close to me may be within that circle of influence when I'm talking to them, but almost everything is in the circle of concern. But where you really become effective as a person is when it's again, that sharp edge, you focused on your circle of influence, what you can actually do between awakening and bedtime. And that's a way to keep sane in a process of history that, like Stephen Dedalus, the James Joyce character, said, history is the nightmare from which I'm trying to awaken. And we are not able to awaken from it yet, but all we can do is focus on our self-development, being ethical, and doing the best job we can within a process we can't control.
What a fantastic note to end on. Before we go, I know you've discussed you're in the process with the sequel to Parallel Journeys. You said you might be going back to add more onto Zap Oracle. You mentioned the AI, the large language model extensions of that process. Is there anything else that's coming down the pipeline for you?
You hit the big things, but the one that it's the real love of all these, things that are like my life work, is actually Parallel Journeys, because this is where I've tried to, realizing I'm an introvert and that I'm not going to change things on the chemical level of causality. I'm trying to work on the alchemical level, where we've seen that stories have an ability to shift reality. And there's all kinds of evidence of this. Even if only, even if I'm the only reader, it still changes what's in the collective unconscious. So Parallel Journeys is an attempt to give people a mythos that shows a way through the kind of apocalyptic scenarios that are looming all around us. And so that's really where I would most like people to go. And the Audible version performed by me, it may be the best version. If you actually, this is a gift to the people who are listening. If you go to the Mass Psychosis thing on the front page of my site, it even gives you free access to the audio version of the book, as well as an ebook version, also free on the website.
Ooh, that's outstanding. So it's hard to beat free, guys, but also I would highly recommend, just because I think Zap is a wonderfully insightful individual. He's a great author. You can just listening to him talk, I'm sure, has been exceptionally entertaining. It's very obvious why I'm going to say you should go look up his works, particularly his books, and perhaps maybe buy a physical copy. I'm sure there's audiobook versions that are for sale. So, this is a man that I think is worthy of our support. I wouldn't have him on the show otherwise. And
thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, this was, I from the bottom of my heart, really, this was fantastic. I'm really glad to have you on. And who knows, maybe we'll get to have you on in the future. And you know what? I think this is probably a good spot to end. You do have like if you type in Zap Oracle on YouTube, that'll pop up and very easily found. A lot of the videos we've mentioned are there. Zaporacle.com. We've said enough times, I think you can find it. Is there anywhere else that people can keep up with you? I don't know. I'm sure you're on social media to some extent, but that might not be something you want any Yahoo to be able to find you on.
They can if they want. I'm not overwhelmed with a giant following or anything, but I have a decent one. But they can sign up for a free newsletter on my website if they want to get specifically addressed emails that I only send out once every couple of months or so. But otherwise, you hit the big ones. The YouTube channel, Zap Oracle, is my most popular social media, if it counts as social media.
All right. Well, with all that said, thank you for being on. And as is customary, would you like the last word?
Well, I just want to thank you for being a kind of beacon too. Even if you're not getting a whole lot of viewers, you're sending out a very powerful signal that, like, there's the news, there's the nightmare of history, but then there's also the chaos magic news for those who want to know alchemically what's going on inside and want to learn how to adjust the source code of reality.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. All right, listeners, we'll see you in the next one.